I'm Evelyn Hayes, 29 years old, standing on the marble steps of Sotheby's auction house in Manhattan, clutching a small velvet box that contains what was once dismissed as my pathetic excuse for an engagement ring. The irony cuts through the crisp October air like a blade. My younger sister Camille had spent months mocking this very ring, calling it embarrassingly cheap and something from a gumball machine, telling anyone who would listen that I was settling for a man who clearly didn't value me enough to buy proper jewelry. What she didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that this modest silver band with its seemingly simple stone had just been appraised at $2.3 million, a priceless heirloom from our late grandmother Rosalind's secret collection that would change everything between us forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The revelation had come just 3 hours earlier, in a mahogany-paneled office overlooking Central Park, when renowned gemologist Dr. Victoria Sterling had looked up from her high-powered magnifying equipment with wide, astonished eyes. "Ms. Hayes," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't just any sapphire. This is a Kashmir sapphire from the 1920s, extremely rare, with exceptional clarity and color saturation. Combined with the platinum setting and these surrounding diamonds, which are also far more valuable than they initially appear, you're looking at a conservative estimate of $2.3 million. This piece belonged to European nobility before somehow making its way to America." I had sat there in stunned silence, thinking about the letter from grandmother Rosalind that had accompanied this ring when my fiancé Oliver proposed 6 months ago. He had inherited it through a complex web of estate distributions, when his own grandmother, who had been Rosalind's dear friend, passed away. The letter, written in Rosalind's elegant script, had simply said, "For my beloved granddaughter Evelyn, when she finds true love. This ring has seen many great romances, and I hope it will bless yours as well. Wear it with pride, knowing you are loved beyond measure." At the time, I had been touched by the sentiment but admittedly disappointed by the ring's appearance. It looked so ordinary compared to the massive diamond solitaires my friends from college had been flaunting on social media. The band was thin, almost delicate, and the central stone, while beautiful, seemed modest, surrounded by what appeared to be small, unremarkable diamonds. When Oliver slipped it onto my finger during his heartfelt proposal on the shores of Lake Champlain, I had focused on his words of love, rather than the jewelry itself. But Camille had noticed immediately. During our family dinner the following week, when Oliver and I announced our engagement, she had barely glanced at him before zeroing in on my left hand with laser focus. "Oh," she had said, her voice dripping with poorly concealed disappointment, "how unique." The way she emphasized unique made it clear she meant something else entirely. Throughout the evening, I caught her whispering to our cousins, gesturing toward my hand with expressions of pity and concern. The criticism had only intensified over the following months. Camille, who had always been the family's golden child with her successful career in pharmaceutical sales and her string of relationships with wealthy men, seemed personally offended by my ring's modest appearance. "I just worry that Oliver doesn't understand your worth," she would say during our weekly family dinners, her voice laced with false concern. "When a man really loves a woman, he shows it through his investment in her future. That ring looks like something you'd find at a vintage shop for $50. Her comments became increasingly bold and hurtful. At my friend Natalie's birthday party, she had actually laughed when other women gathered to admire engagement rings, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Well, at least Evelyn's ring is practical, very low maintenance. You don't have to worry about anyone trying to steal something like that." The laughter that followed had been uncomfortable and forced, but the damage was done. I had excused myself to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes, feeling embarrassed and somehow diminished. The worst incident had occurred just 2 weeks ago, during our cousin Rebecca's bridal shower in the affluent suburb of Wyndham Hills. Camille had brought her new boyfriend, a hedge fund manager named Preston, and had been showing off her own jewelry collection all afternoon. When the conversation turned to engagement rings, she had grabbed my hand without permission and held it up for the entire group to see. "This is what I mean when I say you can't judge a relationship by the ring," she had announced, her voice carrying that familiar tone of mock wisdom. "Some people prioritize different things. Not everyone can afford the finer things in life, and that's perfectly fine." The condescension in her voice had been unmistakable, and I had felt the heat of embarrassment creep up my neck as 25 women stared at my hand with varying degrees of pity and awkward sympathy. Preston had actually squinted at the ring and said, "It's very understated. Minimalist, you could say." The way he said minimalist sounded like a diagnosis of poverty. That night, I had called Oliver in tears, questioning everything about our relationship, and wondering if maybe Camille was right. Maybe the ring was a reflection of his feelings toward me. Oliver, patient and loving as always, had reminded me that the ring had come from his grandmother's collection, passed down through generations, and that its value to him was purely sentimental. "Evelyn," he had said gently, "I chose that ring because it reminded me of you, elegant, timeless, and more beautiful than anything flashy or obvious. If you want something different, we can go shopping tomorrow, but please don't let your sister's opinions change how you feel about something that represents our love." But curiosity had gotten the better of me. After weeks of Camille's relentless commentary, I had decided to get the ring appraised, not because I doubted Oliver's love, but because I wanted to understand what I was wearing. I had expected the appraiser to confirm that it was a nice vintage piece worth maybe a few $1,000s. Enough to prove it wasn't worthless, but nothing that would fundamentally change anything. Standing here now, outside Sotheby's with the official appraisal document in my purse, I can barely process the magnitude of what has just been revealed. This ring that Camille has spent months mocking, this cheap piece of jewelry that has made her so concerned about my self-worth and Oliver's commitment, is worth more than most people's houses. More than Camille's new BMW. More than the down payment on the luxury condo she's been bragging about saving for. The irony is almost too perfect to be real, but the certified appraisal in my purse confirms every detail. In a few hours, I'll be sitting across from my family at our monthly dinner, and for the first time in months, I won't be dreading Camille's inevitable comments about my ring. Instead, I'll be deciding whether to share this earth-shattering information, and if so, how to handle the conversation that will undoubtedly change our relationship forever. But first, I need to call Oliver and share this incredible news with the man who chose this ring not for its monetary value, but because he believed it was worthy of our love story. As I dial his number, I can't help but smile, thinking about how sometimes the most precious things in life are the ones that don't immediately reveal their true worth to the world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing up in the rolling hills of Maplewood, Connecticut, my childhood with Camille seemed picture-perfect from the outside. Our father, Jonathan Hayes, was a successful corporate attorney specializing in mergers and acquisitions, while our mother, Diana, had built a thriving interior design business that catered to the wealthy families scattered throughout Fairfield County. We lived in a sprawling colonial house with manicured gardens, spent summers at our lake house in New Hampshire, and attended the prestigious Maplewood Academy where excellence was simply expected, not celebrated. Camille is 4 years younger than me, and from the moment she could walk it was clear we were destined to be fundamentally different people. Where I was methodical and studious, carefully planning each step of my academic and professional journey, Camille was spontaneous and charismatic, able to charm her way through situations that would have required hours of preparation for anyone else. I earned my acceptance to Yale through relentless studying, countless hours of volunteer work, and a nearly perfect GPA. Camille got into Boston University primarily on the strength of her winning smile and her ability to convince the admissions interview panel that her life experiences were more valuable than traditional academic metrics. Even as children, the patterns that would define our adult relationship were already taking shape. I was the daughter who color-coded her homework assignments and maintained a pristine bedroom that could have been featured in one of Mom's design magazines. My bookshelf was organized alphabetically, my desk always cleared and ready for the next project. Teachers praised my attention to detail and reliability, often using me as an example for other students to follow. By high school, I was valedictorian, editor of the debate team, and the student body president who actually showed up to every meeting with a typed agenda. Camille, on the other hand, operated in a world of beautiful chaos that somehow always worked out in her favor. Her room looked like a boutique had exploded. Designer clothes draped over chairs, jewelry scattered across her vanity, shoes forming artistic piles in every corner. Yet when she emerged each morning, she looked effortlessly glamorous, as if a team of stylists had spent hours perfecting her appearance. When she forgot to study for her chemistry final and ended up sobbing in the guidance counselor's office, somehow she was granted an extension and extra credit opportunities that weren't available to other students. When she crashed Dad's Mercedes into a neighbor's fence during her first month of having a license, the insurance covered everything, and she walked away with a cautionary tale that made her seem endearing rather than irresponsible. Evelyn could learn something from Camille about enjoying life, Mom would often say, completely oblivious to how those words affected me. Not everything has to be so serious, darling. Sometimes spontaneity leads to the most wonderful discoveries. What she didn't see was how much effort went into maintaining the stability that everyone took for granted. While Camille was discovering wonderful spontaneous adventures, I was the one who remembered to submit college applications before deadlines, who kept track of family obligations, and who could be counted on to handle details that others found tedious. The contrast became even more pronounced during college. While I worked part-time at the campus library to help offset my student loans, despite our family's comfortable financial situation, Camille's education was fully funded without question. When I chose to major in environmental science with a focus on sustainable urban planning, a field I was passionate about but which didn't immediately promise high financial returns, there were subtle suggestions that I might want to consider something more practical. When Camille changed her major from business to communications to psychology and finally to marketing, each switch was celebrated as her finding her true calling. My best friend since graduate school, Lauren, saw the dynamic clearly. We met while working on our master's degrees at Columbia, both of us focused on environmental policy, and quickly bonded over our shared dedication to making a real difference in the world. Lauren came from a large family in Portland where achievements were celebrated equally, and each child's unique contributions were valued. Your family has created this weird hierarchy where Camille gets rewarded for being unpredictable and you get taken for granted for being reliable, she observed one evening as we studied for our comprehensive exams. It's like they expect you to be the foundation everyone else can safely be dramatic on top of. Her insight stung because it was so accurate. Throughout my 20s, as I built a respectable career as an environmental consultant for urban development projects, my successes were met with polite acknowledgement and quick transitions to whatever crisis or celebration Camille was currently experiencing. When I received a promotion that came with a significant salary increase and the opportunity to lead a major project redesigning green spaces in downtown Hartford, the family dinner conversation lasted approximately 5 minutes before shifting to Camille's latest dating drama or career pivot. Meanwhile, Camille had found her niche in pharmaceutical sales, a field that perfectly suited her natural charisma and ability to build instant rapport with doctors and hospital administrators. She was genuinely talented at her job, consistently ranking in the top 10% of her company's sales force, and the financial rewards were substantial. By age 25, she was earning more than I was, driving a luxury car and living in a sleek downtown apartment that she loved showcasing on social media. Despite my growing awareness of these family dynamics, I genuinely loved my sister. When her relationship with her college boyfriend Derek imploded after 3 years because he couldn't handle her demanding travel schedule, I was the one who drove down to Boston to help her process the breakup. When she was passed over for a promotion she'd been expecting, I spent hours listening to her analyze every detail of the decision and helping her strategize her next career moves. When she had a minor car accident that left her shaken, I took 2 days off work to drive her to medical appointments and deal with insurance paperwork. "You're the best sister in the world, Evie," she would say, using the childhood nickname that only she was allowed to use. "I honestly don't know how I'd navigate life without you. You're like my personal GPS for everything important." And I believed her. Despite the growing frustration with how my own achievements were overlooked, those moments of genuine appreciation from Camille made me feel like the supportive older sister I'd always tried to be. But as we moved deeper into our late 20s, a troubling pattern became impossible to ignore. Camille's successes were celebrated with elaborate family dinners and social media announcements, while my achievements were noted briefly before conversation moved on to more interesting topics. When she bought her first luxury car, our parents threw a congratulatory barbecue and invited extended family to celebrate her, quote, hard work paying off. When I received recognition from the Connecticut Environmental Council for my innovative work on sustainable development, the news was mentioned during appetizers and forgotten by dessert. The disparity became even more apparent when it came to relationships. Camille's dating life was a source of constant family fascination and concern. Every new boyfriend was analyzed, discussed, and either celebrated or worried over, depending on his profession, appearance, and family background. When she dated a cardiothoracic surgeon for 6 months, our parents treated him like a prospective son-in-law despite Camille's obvious lack of serious interest. When she briefly dated a struggling artist, family dinners became support sessions, focused on helping her, quote, see the importance of financial stability in a partner. My own relationship history, by contrast, was largely ignored. I had dated thoughtfully and deliberately, preferring to build genuine connections rather than pursuing excitement for its own sake. When I introduced the family to David, a fellow environmental scientist I'd been seeing for over a year, he was politely acknowledged but never really embraced as a significant presence in my life. When that relationship ended amicably due to career paths taking us to different cities, the family response was essentially a collective shrug. It was against this backdrop of decades-long family dynamics that I met Oliver Chen Morrison at a conference on sustainable transportation in Burlington, Vermont. He was presenting research on electric vehicle infrastructure while I was discussing urban green space optimization, and we found ourselves in the same coffee line during the first break, arguing good-naturedly about whether bike lanes or electric bus routes were more effective for reducing urban carbon footprints. Oliver was unlike anyone I'd ever dated, brilliant but unpretentious, successful but genuinely humble, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard in the best possible way. He held a PhD in engineering from MIT, worked for a clean energy consulting firm, and somehow managed to make even the most complex technical discussions feel like intimate conversations. More importantly, he saw me, really saw me, in a way that felt both thrilling and completely natural. Our relationship developed slowly and deliberately, built on shared values, intellectual compatibility, and a growing emotional intimacy that felt solid and real. Unlike Camille's dramatic romantic relationships that provided endless family entertainment, my relationship with Oliver was characterized by steady, deepening love rather than exciting turbulence, which, I was beginning to realize, made it far less interesting to my family than it should have been. The pattern of unequal treatment that had defined my childhood became even more pronounced as Camille and I entered our professional lives. What had seemed like harmless family dynamics during our school years evolved into a systematic devaluation of my achievements, paired with disproportionate celebration of Camille's every minor success. The financial disparity between our career paths became a constant undercurrent in family conversations, with Camille's pharmaceutical sales income consistently highlighted while my environmental consulting work was treated as a noble but impractical pursuit. When Camille closed her first major deal with Hartford Hospital, securing a contract worth over $500,000 for her company, our parents organized what they called a quote, victory celebration at the prestigious Stonecrest Country Club. Extended family members were invited, professional photos were taken, and the evening was documented extensively on social media with captions about hard work paying off and achieving the American dream. The event cost more than my monthly salary, and every detail was designed to showcase Camille's success to our social circle. 3 months later, when I was selected as the lead consultant for a groundbreaking urban renewal project that would transform 15 acres of abandoned industrial land into sustainable mixed-use development, the family response was notably different. The project represented 2 years of competitive bidding, collaboration with city planners, and the potential to serve as a model for environmental restoration across Connecticut. It was the kind of career milestone I had been working toward since graduate school, with implications that would extend far beyond financial compensation. The announcement was made during our regular Sunday dinner, sandwiched between discussions of Camille's latest client presentations and Mom's upcoming design conference in Atlanta. "That's wonderful, dear," Mom said, barely looking up from her phone where she was scrolling through photos from Camille's recent work trip to Miami. "I'm sure it will be very fulfilling for you." Dad nodded approvingly but immediately transitioned into asking Camille about her quarterly sales figures. The conversation moved on so quickly that I wondered if anyone had actually processed what I'd shared. Lauren noticed the disparity immediately. She had been invited to several family gatherings over the years and had witnessed these dynamics firsthand. "It's like they've decided that success only counts if it comes with a certain type of visibility and immediate financial reward," she told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings in downtown Hartford. "Your work literally improves people's lives and protects the environment for future generations. But because it doesn't translate to luxury purchases and social media bragging rights, it somehow doesn't register as real achievement." The contrast became even more stark when it came to lifestyle choices and material possessions. Camille's apartment in the trendy downtown district of New Haven was frequently featured in our family conversations. She had hired a professional interior designer, not our mother, interestingly, and had invested in high-end furniture and artwork that she showcased during regular dinner parties and social gatherings. Her walk-in closet was filled with designer clothing that she purchased without hesitation, and her social media presence was carefully curated to reflect a lifestyle of sophisticated urban success. Meanwhile, I had chosen to live in a modest but charming apartment in a converted Victorian house in Hartford's Arts District. The neighborhood was diverse and vibrant, filled with young professionals, artists, and families who valued community over conspicuous consumption. My apartment was beautifully decorated with vintage finds, local artwork, and plants that I had been nurturing for years. I drove a reliable hybrid car that reflected my environmental values, and my wardrobe consisted of well-made pieces that I'd collected thoughtfully over time, rather than impulsively purchasing whatever was trendy. These lifestyle differences might have been simply matters of personal preference, but they became ammunition for subtle judgment within our family dynamic. During holiday gatherings, conversations would inevitably turn to Camille's latest purchases or travel adventures, with detailed descriptions of expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, and exclusive events. When attention occasionally turned to my life, the focus was often on how admirable it was that I lived so simply and how refreshing it was to see someone who wasn't caught up in material things. The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. My choices were consistently framed as virtuous but somehow lesser, as if I were making the best of limited resources rather than deliberately choosing a lifestyle that aligned with my values. When Camille bought a new BMW, it was celebrated as a symbol of her success and good taste. When I mentioned that I was perfectly happy with my efficient Honda, there were knowing looks exchanged and comments about how practical I was being. This dynamic extended to our romantic relationships as well. Camille's dating life had always been a source of family fascination, with each new boyfriend analyzed and discussed in detail. Her relationships tended to be intense and dramatic, filled with grand romantic gestures, exotic vacations, and the kind of visible displays of affection that translated well to social media. When she dated Marcus, a hedge fund manager who owned a yacht and took her on weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard, our parents treated him like visiting royalty, despite his obvious lack of genuine interest in anything beyond surface-level conversation. When she briefly dated Trevor, a trust fund baby who had never worked a day in his life but owned several luxury cars and a condo in Miami, family dinners became showcases for stories about their expensive adventures. Even when these relationships inevitably ended badly, Marcus turned out to be emotionally manipulative, and Trevor was discovered to be dating 3 other women simultaneously. The failures were treated as romantic misfortunes rather than poor judgment calls. My own approach to dating was characteristically more measured and thoughtful. I had never been interested in relationships that were primarily about status or excitement. I preferred to build genuine connections with people who shared my values and could engage in meaningful conversations about the things that mattered to me. This meant I dated less frequently than Camille, but when I did enter into relationships, they tended to be substantial and based on genuine compatibility. However, this approach was consistently misunderstood by my family. When I brought David to family gatherings during our year-long relationship, he was politely acknowledged but never really embraced as a significant presence. David was a brilliant environmental scientist working on climate change research, passionate about his work and deeply committed to making a positive impact on the world. He was kind, intellectually curious, and treated me with genuine respect and affection. But because he drove a 10-year-old Subaru and preferred hiking to expensive restaurants, he somehow didn't register as an impressive choice in my family's estimation. The relationship ended amicably when David received a research opportunity in Costa Rica that would advance his career significantly. We had a mature conversation about the realities of long-distance relationships and decided to part ways while we still cared deeply for each other. It was emotionally difficult but handled with mutual respect and genuine affection. When I shared this news with my family, the response was essentially indifferent, as if a relationship that didn't feature dramatic breakdowns or expensive consolation shopping wasn't worth much emotional investment. This pattern of dismissive treatment extended to other areas of my life as well. When I completed a marathon after months of training, it was mentioned briefly and forgotten quickly. When Camille hired a personal trainer and lost 15 pounds for a beach vacation, it became a multi-week celebration with before and after photos and detailed discussions of her fitness journey. When I published an article in a respected environmental policy journal, it was acknowledged with polite congratulations. When Camille was featured in her company's quarterly newsletter, it was treated as front-page news worthy of multiple family phone calls. The culmination of these patterns came during Camille's 28th birthday celebration, an elaborate affair held at an upscale restaurant in downtown New Haven. She had specifically requested that everyone dress formally and had hired a photographer to document the evening. Throughout dinner, conversation focused exclusively on her recent achievements, her career trajectory, and her plans for purchasing a luxury condo in the following year. When the photographer asked to take some family photos, we arranged ourselves around Camille as if she were the guest of honor at an awards ceremony. Looking at those images later, I was struck by how I appeared in them, smiling and supportive, but somehow peripheral to the main event. It was as if I were a supporting character in someone else's story, rather than an equal member of the family with my own significant life and achievements. That evening, as I drove home alone to my modest apartment, I found myself wondering when I had become so thoroughly marginalized within my own family. The love was still there. I never doubted that my parents and sister cared about me. But somewhere along the way, Their ability to see and value my contributions had been overshadowed by their fascination with a particular type of success that I had never pursued and never wanted. It was against this backdrop of years of subtle but consistent dismissal that I would eventually meet Oliver, and later, that my family's reaction to our engagement would reveal just how deeply these patterns of judgment and misunderstanding had taken root in our relationships with each other. Despite the growing awareness of these frustrating family dynamics, my love for Camille remained genuine and unwavering. When crisis struck her life, I was invariably the first person she called, and I responded without hesitation every single time. This pattern had been established during our college years and only intensified as we moved through our 20s, with me taking on the role of emotional support system, practical problem solver, and unconditional advocate whenever Camille's world became turbulent. The first major crisis occurred during her junior year at Boston University, when her roommate situation imploded spectacularly. Camille had been living with 3 other girls in an expensive off-campus apartment near Fenway Park, and what started as minor disagreements about cleaning schedules and guest policies escalated into a full-scale living arrangement disaster. According to Camille's tearful phone calls, her roommates had ganged up against her, accusing her of being inconsiderate and financially irresponsible. The situation reached a breaking point when they discovered she had been using the shared credit card for personal purchases, assuming she could pay it back before anyone noticed. When Camille called me sobbing at 2 a.m, explaining that her roommates had given her a week to find alternative housing, I didn't hesitate. I drove the 3 hours from New Haven to Boston that same night, arriving with my car packed with boxes and packing supplies. We spent the entire weekend moving her belongings out of the hostel apartment and into a temporary sublet I helped her find through my own college connections. I paid the deposit and first month's rent myself, knowing that Camille's part-time job at a boutique clothing store wouldn't cover the emergency expenses. Throughout this process, I listened patiently as Camille explained her side of the story, how her roommates were jealous of her social life and had been looking for reasons to exclude her. I helped her craft diplomatic emails to resolve the credit card situation and even attended a mediation meeting with the landlord to ensure she wouldn't face legal complications. When our parents learned about the crisis, their response was to worry about Camille's emotional well-being and praise my dedication to helping her through a difficult situation. 2 years later, when Camille was struggling to find employment after graduation, I once again stepped into my familiar role as rescuer and advocate. Despite her impressive GPA and the networking opportunities provided by her marketing degree, she was having difficulty translating her college experience into professional opportunities. Her job interviews weren't converting to offers, and she was becoming increasingly discouraged about her prospects. I spent countless hours helping her refine her resume, practicing interview questions with her via video calls, and leveraging my own professional network to identify opportunities in pharmaceutical sales, a field where her natural charisma and interpersonal skills would be genuine assets. When she finally received an offer from a mid-sized pharmaceutical company based in Hartford, I helped her negotiate the salary and benefits package, drawing on my own experience with employment contracts to ensure she was getting fair compensation. The transition to professional life brought new challenges that somehow always became my responsibilities to help navigate. When Camille struggled with the technical aspects of her sales training, I spent evenings helping her memorize drug names and understanding complex medication interactions. When she had conflicts with her supervisor during her first year, I helped her develop strategies for professional communication and workplace diplomacy. When she was passed over for a promotion she felt she deserved, I helped her request feedback, identify areas for improvement, and develop a professional development plan. Each crisis followed a similar pattern. Camille would call me in distress, often crying and feeling overwhelmed by whatever challenge she was facing. I would drop whatever I was doing to provide emotional support, practical assistance, and strategic guidance. The problems were always urgent and required immediate attention, pulling me away from my own work and personal commitments. But I did it willingly, because in those moments of genuine vulnerability, I felt like the loving, protective older sister I had always wanted to be. The financial dimension of these rescues became increasingly significant as we moved through our 20s. When Camille's car was stolen from her apartment complex, and her insurance payout wasn't sufficient to replace it immediately, I loaned her $8,000 to purchase a reliable used vehicle. When she wanted to attend her college friend's destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas but couldn't afford the trip on her entry-level salary, I covered her airfare and hotel costs. When she decided to pursue additional certification in pharmaceutical sales but couldn't afford the course fees, I paid for her training program. These loans were always presented as temporary arrangements, with Camille promising to pay me back as soon as her financial situation stabilized. She would create elaborate repayment schedules and send me grateful text messages about how much my support meant to her. But as months turned into years, the repayments never materialized, and bringing up the subject felt petty and unsisterly. Eventually, I accepted that these loans were actually gifts, though I never mentioned this realization to Camille or our parents. The emotional labor involved in being Camille's primary support system was equally draining, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Every crisis required hours of phone conversations, careful navigation of her emotional responses, and diplomatic problem-solving that took into account her tendency toward dramatic reactions. I became expert at anticipating her needs, managing her stress levels, and providing the exact type of reassurance that would help her move forward constructively. When her relationship with Derek ended badly, he had apparently grown tired of her demanding schedule and high-maintenance emotional needs. I spent an entire weekend in Boston helping her process the breakup. We analyzed every text message exchange, discussed the relationship's strengths and weaknesses, and developed strategies for moving forward. I held her while she cried, brought her favorite comfort foods, and listened to hours of detailed recounting about their arguments and incompatibilities. During this visit, something shifted in my understanding of our relationship dynamic. As I watched Camille cycle through intense emotions, anger, sadness, self-pity, righteous indignation, I realized that I had become her emotional regulation system. She experienced feelings intensely and immediately, then relied on me to help her process and manage them. Meanwhile, my own emotional needs were consistently set aside in favor of managing whatever crisis was currently consuming her attention. This pattern became even more apparent when I was dealing with my own professional and personal challenges. When I was going through my breakup with David, struggling with the decision to end a relationship I valued because of geographical realities, Camille's response was perfunctory and distracted. She offered brief sympathy before transitioning into detailed descriptions of her own dating adventures and workplace dramas. When I was stressed about a major project deadline that could significantly impact my career trajectory, family conversations remained focused on Camille's latest achievements and concerns. The most telling incident occurred when I was hospitalized for 3 days with severe pneumonia during my second year of graduate school. I had been working excessive hours on my thesis research while maintaining a part-time job, and my immune system had completely crashed. Lauren was the one who found me collapsed in my apartment and drove me to the emergency room. She stayed with me throughout the scary first night when my fever spiked dangerously high and called my parents to inform them of the situation. Camille's response to this medical emergency was to send a get-well text message and promise to visit when her work schedule permitted. She never came. Our parents drove up from Connecticut once during my hospital stay, bringing flowers and expressing concern, but they left after a few hours to attend Camille's company awards dinner, where she was receiving recognition for exceeding her quarterly sales targets. The contrast was stark. My genuine medical crisis was acknowledged briefly, while Camille's professional achievement was treated as the priority worthy of their presence and celebration. Even during my recovery period, when I was weak and struggling to catch up on coursework I had missed, Camille called multiple times seeking emotional support for various workplace conflicts and dating dramas. It never seemed to occur to her that I might need support during this vulnerable time, or that my capacity for listening and problem-solving might be temporarily diminished due to my own health challenges. Yet despite these patterns, I continued to show up for Camille because I loved her, and because the moments of genuine gratitude and connection felt worth preserving. When she would say, "Evie, you're literally the best sister in the world. I don't know what I'd do without you," I felt valued and needed in a way that validated all the energy I had invested in our relationship. Those words meant everything to me, especially coming from someone whose approval had become increasingly important as our parents' attention remained focused primarily on her dramatic life events. Looking back now, I can see how this dynamic prepared the ground for everything that would follow with Oliver and the engagement ring. I had spent years establishing myself as the family member who could be counted on to provide support without requiring reciprocal attention or recognition. I had accepted the role of the reliable one whose own needs could be safely overlooked because I would never create dramatic scenes or demand equal consideration. This foundation of unequal emotional investment would make Camille's treatment of my engagement and my ring feel particularly devastating, because it represented not just immediate cruelty, but the culmination of decades of taking my dedication for granted, while expecting me to celebrate achievements that highlighted the disparity in how our choices and values were perceived within our family. It was at the International Conference on Sustainable Urban Development in Burlington, Vermont, that I first encountered Oliver Chen Morrison, though our initial meeting was hardly romantic. I had been attending the 3-day conference to present my research on integrating green infrastructure with affordable housing developments, while Oliver was there to discuss his groundbreaking work on renewable energy microgrids for urban communities. We found ourselves in an unexpectedly heated debate during the coffee break following the morning sessions, arguing passionately about whether solar panel installations or urban tree canopy expansion provided better long-term environmental returns on investment. "You're completely overlooking the carbon sequestration data," I insisted, gesturing emphatically with my conference program while we stood in line for what had to be the worst coffee I'd ever encountered. A mature tree can absorb 48 pounds of carbon dioxide annually for decades, while solar panels require significant manufacturing resources and have a finite operational lifespan. Oliver adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and smiled with the kind of patient condescension that immediately irritated me. "That's assuming optimal growing conditions and ignoring the immediate energy offset that solar provides," he countered, his slight British accent making his disagreement sound more polite than it actually was. "We can't afford to wait 30 years for trees to reach maturity when we need carbon reduction solutions right now." What started as professional disagreement evolved into genuine intellectual stimulation as we continued our debate through lunch, then during the afternoon workshop sessions, and eventually over dinner at a small farm-to-table restaurant near Lake Champlain. Oliver possessed the rare combination of brilliant technical knowledge and genuine humility that I found utterly captivating. He could explain complex engineering concepts in accessible terms without ever seeming patronizing, and he listened to my arguments with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was actually considering changing his mind, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Over the course of that evening, I learned that Oliver had grown up in a small town outside Manchester, England, where his father worked as a mechanical engineer and his mother taught mathematics at the local secondary school. He had earned his PhD in sustainable engineering from MIT, where he had focused on developing affordable renewable energy solutions for underserved communities. His work with clean energy consulting had taken him to rural villages in Guatemala, urban centers in Morocco, and indigenous communities in northern Canada, always with the goal of creating sustainable systems that could be maintained locally, rather than requiring ongoing external support. What struck me most about Oliver was his complete lack of pretension despite his impressive credentials and achievements. He drove a 7-year-old Toyota Prius that he had purchased used, lived in a modest apartment in Cambridge that he shared with an enormous rescue dog named Archimedes, and seemed genuinely more interested in the impact of his work than in the recognition it brought him. When I mentioned my own research on environmental justice and sustainable development, He asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated he understood the social implications of environmental policy, not just the technical aspects. Our conversation continued long past dinner, walking along the moonlit shores of Lake Champlain while discussing everything from climate policy to our favorite books to our shared love of hiking in places where cell phone service didn't exist. There was an ease to our interaction that felt both exciting and completely natural, as if we had been having these conversations for years rather than hours. When Oliver walked me back to my hotel, I found myself hoping the conference would last longer than 3 days. The following morning, Oliver appeared at my breakfast table with 2 cups of decent coffee he had somehow procured from a cafe off-site and a handwritten apology note for his obviously incorrect assertions about carbon sequestration timelines. The note was written on hotel stationery in careful handwriting and included a small sketch of a tree with solar panels hanging from its branches like Christmas ornaments. It was simultaneously sweet, funny, and exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture that made me realize this connection was worth pursuing beyond the conference. We spent the rest of the conference together, attending each other's presentations and continuing our ongoing debates about sustainable development strategies. Oliver's presentation on community-scale renewable energy systems was brilliant and inspiring, demonstrating how engineering solutions could be implemented in ways that empowered local communities rather than creating dependency on external expertise. My own presentation on affordable green housing initiatives received enthusiastic questions from the audience, including several from Oliver that helped me clarify important points about scalability and funding mechanisms. When the conference ended, we exchanged contact information with genuine intentions of staying in touch, but I honestly wasn't sure whether our connection would survive the transition from the intense, focused environment of an academic conference to the realities of our separate lives in different cities. Oliver lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, while I was based in Hartford, Connecticut, close enough for occasional visits but far enough apart that maintaining a relationship would require deliberate effort from both of us. To my delight, Oliver called me 3 days after returning home, ostensibly to share an article he thought I would find interesting about innovative urban forestry programs in Copenhagen. The article was indeed fascinating, but our conversation quickly expanded to cover our respective work projects, weekend plans, and a surprisingly detailed discussion about our favorite hiking trails in New England. That call led to regular evening conversations that stretched for hours, covering everything from professional challenges to childhood memories to our shared fascination with environmental documentaries. Our first official date occurred 3 weeks later, when Oliver drove down to Hartford specifically to take me to dinner at a restaurant that specialized in locally sourced ingredients and had implemented impressive sustainability practices. He had researched options carefully, wanting to choose somewhere that would align with our shared values, while still providing a special experience. The evening was perfect. Conversation flowed effortlessly, the food was exceptional, and I found myself completely charmed by Oliver's combination of intellectual depth and genuine kindness. What developed over the following months was the healthiest, most balanced relationship I had ever experienced. Oliver was consistently supportive of my work and genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. He celebrated my professional achievements with enthusiasm that felt completely authentic, asking detailed questions about my projects, and remembering important deadlines and meetings. When I was stressed about a particularly challenging client presentation, he drove down from Cambridge on a Tuesday evening just to bring me dinner and help me practice my talking points. Unlike the dramatic, emotionally turbulent relationships that characterized Camille's dating history, my relationship with Oliver was marked by steady deepening of intimacy and trust. We were both adults who had done the work of understanding ourselves and what we wanted in a partner. Our disagreements were handled with respect and curiosity rather than defensiveness. Our shared values provided a strong foundation for building a life together, while our different areas of expertise kept our conversations intellectually stimulating. The contrast with my family's typical relationship patterns was stark, and, I eventually realized, somewhat problematic from their perspective. When I brought Oliver to family gatherings, he was polite and engaging, but he didn't provide the kind of dramatic entertainment that had characterized Camille's boyfriends. He didn't own luxury cars or take expensive vacations that could be discussed extensively at family dinners. He didn't work in finance or medicine or other fields that carried obvious social prestige. He was simply a genuinely good man who treated me with respect and shared my commitment to making a positive impact on the world. During our first family dinner together, Oliver engaged thoughtfully with Dad's questions about renewable energy policy and listened attentively to Mom's descriptions of her latest design projects. He complimented the meal genuinely and offered to help with cleanup. He asked Camille about her work in pharmaceutical sales and seemed genuinely interested in her responses. But somehow his very normalcy seemed to render him invisible to my family in a way that was both frustrating and revealing. After he left that evening, the family's discussion about Oliver was notably brief and lukewarm. "He seems very nice," Mom said in the tone she typically used for describing pleasant but unremarkable acquaintances. "Very steady," Dad added, which in our family's vocabulary was often code for boring. Camille's assessment was even more telling. "He's definitely perfect for you, Evie. Very practical and reliable." The way she said practical made it sound like a consolation prize rather than a genuine compliment. As our relationship deepened over the course of 18 months, I found myself in the unfamiliar position of being completely happy with someone who didn't generate family excitement or drama. Oliver was becoming the person I wanted to share my daily experiences with, the one whose opinion I valued most on important decisions, and the partner who made me feel truly seen and appreciated for who I was, rather than who I might become or what I might achieve. When Oliver started talking about marriage and our future together, I realized that I had found something I hadn't even known I was looking for, a relationship based on genuine partnership, shared values, and mutual respect, rather than external validation or family approval. Little did I know that this foundation of authentic love would soon be tested by my family's reaction to how Oliver chose to express his commitment to our future together. When Oliver and I began discussing marriage seriously 18 months into our relationship, I felt a profound sense of certainty about our future together that I had never experienced before. We had reached that comfortable stage where we could envision building a life together without the anxiety or uncertainty that had characterized my previous relationships. Our conversations about marriage weren't driven by external pressure or timeline expectations, but by a genuine desire to formalize the partnership we had already created through our shared values, mutual respect, and deep emotional connection. Oliver approached the engagement planning with the same thoughtfulness that characterized everything else about our relationship. Rather than making assumptions about what I might want, he asked careful questions about my preferences regarding proposal style, ring preferences, and timing. I told him honestly that I valued sentiment over spectacle, that I preferred meaningful gestures to expensive displays, and that I would be happiest with something intimate and personal rather than a public performance designed for social media documentation. When he mentioned that he had inherited some family jewelry from his grandmother's estate that had been passed down through his mother's side of the family, I was genuinely touched by the idea of wearing something with historical significance and emotional meaning. His grandmother, Eleanor Chen Morrison, had been a remarkable woman who immigrated to England from Scotland in the 1940s and built a successful textile business while raising 4 children as a largely single mother after her husband died young in an industrial accident. The inheritance had come through a complex network of family connections when Eleanor's dear friend, Rosalind Hayes, who turned out to be my own grandmother, had specifically requested that certain pieces go to Eleanor's descendants when they found meaningful relationships. The letter that accompanied the jewelry collection explained that Rosalind and Eleanor had maintained a close friendship for over 50 years, supporting each other through various life challenges and celebrating each other's family milestones. Oliver showed me the collection one evening in his Cambridge apartment, carefully removing pieces from a vintage wooden jewelry box that had belonged to his grandmother. There were several rings, A delicate necklace with matching earrings and a few brooches that reflected the sophisticated but understated style of mid-20th century design. The engagement ring that caught my attention was unlike anything I had seen in contemporary jewelry stores. A platinum band with an intricate Art Deco setting that featured what appeared to be a modestly sized central sapphire surrounded by small diamonds in a geometric pattern. "This one has always been my favorite," Oliver said, holding the ring up to catch the light from his apartment window. "My grandmother told me it was given to Rosalind by someone very special during the 1920s, and that it had witnessed many great love stories. She hoped it would find its way to someone who would appreciate both its history and its meaning, rather than its monetary value." The ring was undeniably beautiful in a subtle, sophisticated way that appealed to my aesthetic preferences far more than the large, flashy diamond solitaires that seem popular among my contemporaries. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with delicate engraving along the band and a setting that allowed light to play through the central stone in fascinating ways. When Oliver slipped it onto my finger during his proposal on the shores of Lake Champlain, the same location where we had walked during our first long conversation, it felt perfect in a way that had nothing to do with size or obvious value. The proposal itself was exactly what I had hoped for: intimate, meaningful, and focused on our commitment to each other rather than creating a spectacle for others to witness or photograph. Oliver had planned a weekend getaway to a small inn near the lake, and we spent Saturday hiking trails we had discovered during previous visits to the area. As the sun was setting, he led me to a secluded spot overlooking the water, where he had somehow arranged for a small picnic setup, complete with wine from a local vineyard and foods from our favorite farm-to-table restaurant. His proposal speech was heartfelt and specific, referencing shared memories from our relationship and his vision for our future together. He talked about wanting to build a life based on the values we both cherished, about supporting each other's professional goals while creating a home filled with love and intellectual curiosity. When he presented the ring, he shared the story of its history and explained why he believed it was perfect for us, a symbol of enduring love that had been blessed by the friendship between our grandmothers. I said yes immediately, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of everything he had planned and the genuine emotion in his words. The ring fit perfectly, and as I admired it on my finger, I felt a deep sense of connection not only to Oliver, but to the women who had worn it before me. There was something profoundly moving about the idea that this ring had been chosen specifically for our relationship by people who had loved us before we even knew each other. We spent the evening talking about our wedding plans, our hopes for the future, and our excitement about sharing our news with family and friends. I felt completely confident about the choice we were making and eager to begin this new chapter of our lives together. The ring felt like a perfect symbol of our relationship, beautiful in its understated elegance, meaningful in its history, and chosen with thoughtfulness rather than showiness. However, when we began sharing our engagement news with family and friends, I started to notice reactions that caught me off guard. My close friends and colleagues responded with genuine enthusiasm and excitement, focusing on our obvious happiness and the sweet story of how the ring had come to us through our grandmother's friendship. Lauren immediately understood the significance of the family connection and was moved by the romantic continuity of the ring's history. But family reactions were notably different, particularly from Camille. During our announcement dinner at my parents' house the following weekend, I watched her face carefully as I extended my hand to show off the engagement ring. Her initial expression was one of confusion, as if she were looking for something she couldn't find. Then came a fleeting look of what I could only describe as disappointment, followed quickly by a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh," she said, taking my hand to examine the ring more closely. "How unique." The way she emphasized the word unique made it clear that she didn't mean it as a compliment. "It's very vintage-looking. Is it an antique?" When Oliver explained the family history and the connection between our grandmothers, Camille nodded politely, but I could see her mind working, trying to reconcile the ring's modest appearance with her expectations for an engagement ring worthy of celebration. Throughout the dinner, I caught her glancing at my hand with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense to her. My parents' reaction was more diplomatically positive, but I sensed underlying confusion about Oliver's choice. They congratulated us warmly and seemed genuinely happy about our engagement, but I noticed their attention focused more on our wedding planning timeline and our future living arrangements than on the ring itself. When Mom did comment on the ring, she used words like interesting and distinctive that felt like polite ways of expressing reservation. The contrast with how other engagements had been received in our family was striking. When Camille's college friend had gotten engaged the previous year with a 2-carat diamond solitaire, our family dinner conversation had included detailed discussions about the ring's specifications, the proposal story, and extensive admiration for the boyfriend's obvious financial investment in their relationship. My ring, despite its beauty and meaningful history, seemed to generate polite acknowledgement rather than genuine enthusiasm. Over the following weeks, I began to notice subtle comments and reactions that suggested my family viewed the ring as somehow insufficient or disappointing. These weren't direct criticisms. My family was too well-mannered for outright insults, but rather a series of small observations and comparisons that gradually undermined my confidence in Oliver's choice, and, by extension, his commitment to our relationship. The foundation was being laid for the systematic campaign of judgment and mockery that would define the next several months of my engagement, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I was too happy about my relationship and too focused on planning our future together to fully process the implications of my family's lukewarm response to this symbol of Oliver's love and our commitment to each other. The subtle comments about my engagement ring began almost immediately after our family announcement dinner, but they started so gradually that I initially dismissed them as innocent observations rather than the beginning of a sustained campaign of criticism. Camille seemed particularly fixated on the ring's appearance, bringing it up during conversations where it had no natural place in the discussion, and making comparisons that felt increasingly pointed and deliberate. During our first family gathering after the engagement, while we were helping Mom prepare dinner for our monthly Sunday meal, Camille picked up my hand without warning while I was chopping vegetables, and examined the ring under the kitchen's bright overhead lighting. "You know, Evie," she said in a tone that suggested helpful concern, "I was looking at engagement ring trends online, and vintage styles are definitely having a moment. Though most people who choose vintage usually go for something a bit more substantial. This is more like genuinely old rather than vintage-inspired." The comment stung because it contained just enough truth to be plausible, while managing to diminish both the ring's value and Oliver's judgment in choosing it. When I tried to explain again about the family connection and the sentimental significance, Camille nodded sympathetically and said, "Oh, I totally understand the emotional value. It's just that most men want to show their commitment through something that reflects their financial investment in the relationship, too. But Oliver probably figured you'd appreciate the history more than anything flashy." The implication was clear. Oliver had chosen sentiment over expense because he either couldn't afford something impressive or didn't think I was worth the investment. The suggestion was delivered with such apparent concern for my feelings that I couldn't object without seeming defensive or ungrateful for her interest in my engagement. These conversations became increasingly frequent and uncomfortable over the following weeks. During a family dinner where we were discussing our preliminary wedding plans, Camille steered the conversation toward engagement ring insurance and appraisal values. "Have you had it appraised yet?" she asked, cutting her salmon with unnecessary precision. "I mean, for insurance purposes. You'd hate to lose something so meaningful and not be able to replace it exactly." When I admitted that we hadn't thought about insurance yet, she launched into a detailed explanation of how engagement ring appraisals worked, emphasizing that the process would establish the ring's actual monetary value as opposed to its sentimental worth. "My friend Jessica's ring appraised for twice what her fiancé paid because he got such a good deal," she said, her eyes gleaming with what seemed like helpful enthusiasm. "Though I suppose with vintage pieces sometimes the appraisal can be disappointing if the stones aren't what they appear to be." The implication that my ring might contain inferior or fake stones was delivered with such apparent innocence that I couldn't address it directly without seeming paranoid. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I found myself looking at the ring differently, wondering if Oliver and I had been naive about its actual value or quality. The criticism escalated during Camille's birthday celebration at an upscale restaurant in downtown New Haven. She had invited several of her close friends, and the conversation naturally turned to relationships and recent engagements. When someone asked to see my ring, Camille immediately jumped in with commentary that framed the ring in the worst possible light. "Isn't it interesting?" she said, taking my hand and holding it out for the group to examine. "It's from Oliver's family collection, very sentimental. Evie's always been more practical about these things than romantic. She's never been the type to care about having the biggest diamond or the most expensive setting. She values meaning over materialism." The way she presented this information made my supposed practicality sound like settling for less rather than making a thoughtful choice. Her friends examined the ring politely, offering comments like, "How sweet," and "so unique," that echoed the same diplomatic language my family had been using. I noticed them exchanging glances that suggested they were thinking exactly what Camille wanted them to think, that I was making the best of a disappointing situation. The most painful moment came when one of Camille's friends, a woman named Victoria who worked in luxury retail, held my hand closer to examine the ring's details. "The setting is lovely," she said carefully, "very Art Deco. And sapphires can be quite beautiful when they're good quality, though it's sometimes hard to tell with older pieces whether you're looking at natural stones or synthetic ones." The technology for creating convincing artificial gems was getting quite sophisticated by the 1920s. The suggestion that my ring might contain synthetic stones was devastating, not because synthetic stones were necessarily inferior, but because it implied that either Oliver's family had been deceived about the ring's authenticity, or that Oliver had knowingly given me something fake while representing it as a precious family heirloom. Camille's expression during this exchange was one of sympathetic concern, as if she felt terrible that these questions were being raised, but believed they needed to be addressed for my own protection. As the evening progressed, the conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself constantly aware of my ring and increasingly self-conscious about its appearance. When other women gestured while talking, their engagement rings caught the light in ways that seemed more brilliant and impressive than mine. When someone mentioned wedding planning budgets, I wondered if Oliver's choice of a family ring indicated financial limitations that would affect our ability to afford the kind of wedding we wanted. The psychological campaign continued in more subtle ways over the following month. Camille began sending me articles about engagement ring trends, usually accompanied by messages like, "Thought you might find this interesting," or "Just saw this and thought of you." The articles invariably featured large, modern diamond rings with impressive carat weights and contemporary settings. One article was specifically about the importance of ring insurance and professional appraisals, with detailed explanations of how family heirlooms sometimes turned out to be less valuable than their sentimental significance suggested. During this period, I also began noticing how other people reacted to my ring during casual social interactions. When colleagues congratulated me on my engagement, their focus seemed to shift quickly from the ring to other aspects of our relationship. When acquaintances asked to see the ring, their responses were politely positive, but lacked the enthusiasm I had witnessed when other friends had gotten engaged with more contemporary, obviously expensive rings. The cumulative effect of these interactions was profoundly damaging to my confidence in Oliver's choice and, by extension, in his feelings toward me. I began to wonder if I had been naive about what engagement rings were supposed to represent. Had I been so focused on sentiment and meaning that I had missed important social signals about commitment and investment? Was Oliver's choice of a family ring actually a way of avoiding the expense of purchasing something new and impressive? These doubts were particularly painful because they contradicted everything I thought I knew about Oliver's character and our relationship. He had always been thoughtful, generous, and attentive to my preferences. He had never shown any signs of being financially irresponsible or uncommitted to our future together. But the constant drip of subtle criticism from Camille, combined with the lukewarm reactions from others, began to erode my confidence in my own judgment. The situation came to a head during a family barbecue at my parents' lake house in New Hampshire. Extended family members were visiting, including several cousins who hadn't seen my ring yet. When the inevitable ring examination occurred, Camille positioned herself as the helpful interpreter of my engagement story, explaining the family history while managing to emphasize every aspect that made the ring seem like a consolation prize rather than a deliberate choice. Oliver's grandmother left him some lovely pieces, she explained to our Aunt Patricia, who was examining the ring with polite interest. This one has such a sweet story about friendship between the families. Evie's always been drawn to things with history and meaning, rather than contemporary styles. She's never been impressed by flashy displays of wealth. The way Camille framed my preferences made them sound like limitations rather than choices, as if I had convinced myself to appreciate modesty because I couldn't obtain or didn't deserve something genuinely impressive. When Aunt Patricia commented that the ring was charming in its own way, I felt a familiar wave of embarrassment and disappointment that I was beginning to associate with any discussion of my engagement. That evening, as Oliver and I walked along the lake shore after the family gathering, I found myself bringing up the subject of ring appraisals and insurance for the first time. I tried to frame it as a practical concern, but Oliver immediately sensed the underlying anxiety in my questions. "Evelyn," he said, stopping to face me directly, "is something wrong? You seem worried about the ring lately. If you'd prefer something different, we can absolutely look at other options. I chose this ring because I thought you'd love its history and its connection to our families, but your happiness is more important to me than any piece of jewelry." His response was so genuine and caring that I felt terrible for allowing Camille's campaign of doubt to affect my feelings about his thoughtful choice. But the damage had been done, and I found myself wondering whether getting the ring appraised might actually be a good idea. Not because I doubted Oliver's intentions, but because I needed to arm myself with factual information that could counter Camille's subtle but persistent implications about its worth and authenticity. The moment that would fundamentally change everything between Camille and me occurred during what should have been a celebratory family dinner at Stonecrest Country Club, the same prestigious venue where we had celebrated her major sales achievement the previous year. The occasion was our cousin Rebecca's engagement announcement, and the entire extended family had gathered to meet her fiancé Michael and admire her stunning 3-carat diamond solitaire that had apparently cost more than a luxury car. I had arrived at the dinner feeling optimistic about the evening, hoping that focusing on Rebecca's happiness might provide a respite from the constant underlying tension about my own ring. Oliver was traveling for work, so I attended alone, which I initially thought might actually be better, since it would allow me to focus entirely on supporting Rebecca without having to manage family dynamics around my own relationship. The dinner began pleasantly enough, with congratulations flowing freely and genuine excitement about Rebecca's engagement to Michael, who worked in investment banking and had proposed during an elaborate weekend in Paris that had been extensively documented on social media. Rebecca's ring was undeniably spectacular, a flawless diamond in a classic Tiffany setting that caught the light beautifully and commanded attention from across the room. As family members took turns examining the ring and hearing the proposal story, I felt genuinely happy for Rebecca, while also experiencing a familiar pang of self-consciousness about my own modest engagement ring. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and I found myself automatically covering my left hand with my right to minimize the visual comparison between our very different symbols of commitment. Camille arrived late, making her usual dramatic entrance in a new designer dress that she mentioned had been a reward for exceeding her latest sales targets. She immediately joined the cluster of family members surrounding Rebecca, adding her voice to the chorus of admiration for the ring and the romantic proposal story. For the first hour of dinner, conversation flowed naturally around wedding planning, venue options, and the various logistics of organizing a celebration worthy of such an impressive engagement. The turning point came during dessert, when someone suggested taking group photos to commemorate the evening. As family members arranged themselves around Rebecca and Michael, cameras and phones appeared, and the focus naturally shifted to capturing images that would preserve this moment of celebration. Rebecca was glowing with happiness, extending her hand in various poses to showcase the ring while family members gathered around to share in the photogenic moment. It was during this photo session that Camille made the decision that would irrevocably damage our relationship. As people were repositioning themselves for different group combinations, she suddenly grabbed my left hand and pulled it into the frame alongside Rebecca's, holding both our rings up to the camera with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Oh, this is perfect," she announced loudly enough for the entire restaurant section to hear. "We should get a photo of both engagement rings together." Look, everyone, we have both ends of the spectrum represented here. Rebecca's gorgeous traditional solitaire and Evie's, well, her sweet little vintage piece. The silence that followed her announcement was immediate and mortifying. Every conversation in our section of the restaurant seemed to pause as attention focused on our table, and I felt heat rush to my face as I realized that Camille had essentially put my ring on display as a deliberate contrast to Rebecca's impressive diamond. She held our hands up higher, ensuring that anyone with a camera could capture the visual comparison between the two rings. "Isn't it interesting how different people have different priorities?" Camille continued, her voice carrying that familiar tone of false wisdom that I had learned to dread. Rebecca's Michael clearly wanted to make a statement about his success and his commitment, very traditional and romantic, while Oliver went with something more practical, more about history and sentiment than investment. The way she emphasized certain words made her meaning unmistakable. Rebecca had received a ring that demonstrated her fiancé's love and financial capability, while I had received something cheap disguised as meaningful. The comparison was being made publicly, in front of our entire extended family, with photographic documentation that would preserve this moment of humiliation forever. "Camille," I said quietly, trying to pull my hand away, "that's not really— Oh, I think it's wonderful that we're all so different." She interrupted, tightening her grip on my hand and smiling brightly for the cameras. "Evie has always been the practical one in the family. She's never needed flashy things to feel valued. Some women need the biggest diamond to feel special, but Evie is perfectly content with something simple and understated. It's actually quite admirable how modest her expectations are." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, and I watched as family members exchanged uncomfortable glances while trying to figure out how to respond to this obviously awkward situation. Rebecca looked mortified on my behalf, clearly understanding that she was being used as a prop in Camille's campaign to humiliate me. Uncle Robert began to say something about how both rings were beautiful in their own ways, but Camille wasn't finished. "I just think it says so much about a person's character," she continued, finally releasing my hand but continuing to gesture toward both rings. "Rebecca obviously has high standards and expectations for how she should be treated. She knows her worth and isn't afraid to expect her partner to demonstrate his commitment through significant investment. While Evie is just grateful to be loved, regardless of how that love is expressed materially." The cruelty of this assessment was breathtaking in its precision. With just a few carefully chosen words, Camille had managed to suggest that Rebecca was appropriately valued while I was settling for inadequate treatment, that Rebecca had healthy self-respect while I had low standards, and that the difference in our rings reflected fundamental differences in how our fiancés viewed our worth as partners. I sat frozen in my chair, feeling the eyes of 25 family members on me while struggling to process the magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't subtle criticism or innocent comparison. This was a deliberate, public attack designed to humiliate me and undermine my relationship in front of our entire family. The fact that it was delivered with a smile and framed as admiration for my supposed modesty made it even more devastating. "I think both rings are beautiful and meaningful," Rebecca said quietly, clearly trying to diffuse the tension that Camille had created. Every couple has their own way of expressing love and commitment. But the damage was already done. The photos had been taken, the comparisons had been made publicly, and everyone present had witnessed Camille's assessment of my relationship and my supposed willingness to accept less than I deserved. As conversation gradually resumed and moved to safer topics, I remained silent, mechanically participating in dinner while internally reeling from what felt like a deliberate betrayal by my own sister. The ride home that evening was a blur of tears and rage as I finally allowed myself to fully experience the humiliation I had just endured. For months, I had been making excuses for Camille's comments, attributing them to misguided concern or innocent insensitivity. But tonight had stripped away any possibility of charitable interpretation. This had been a calculated attack, delivered publicly for maximum impact, designed to position me as pathetic and grateful, rather than genuinely loved and appropriately valued. When I arrived home and called Oliver to tell him about the evening, I found myself crying so hard that I could barely speak coherently. His immediate response was protective anger on my behalf, followed by gentle reassurance about our relationship and his commitment to me. But even his loving support couldn't undo the public nature of what had happened, or the fact that my own sister had deliberately orchestrated my humiliation in front of our entire family. That night, lying awake and replaying every moment of the evening, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Camille and my understanding of my place within our family. This hadn't been a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. It had been a deliberate choice to prioritize her own sense of superiority over my dignity and emotional well-being. The question now was whether I would continue to accept this treatment or finally find the courage to protect myself from further attacks. The answer to that question would come sooner than I expected, and in a way that would force our entire family to confront the toxic dynamics that had been developing for years underneath the surface of our supposedly loving relationships. The humiliation from the country club dinner marked a turning point in my tolerance for Camille's behavior, but it was the conversation that followed 3 days later that finally pushed me past my breaking point. I had spent those intervening days trying to process what had happened, discussing it extensively with Lauren and Oliver, and attempting to decide how to address the situation with Camille directly. Part of me hoped that she might reach out with an apology, recognizing that her public comparison had crossed a line, but no such acknowledgement came. Instead, Camille called me on Wednesday evening with what she presented as exciting news about a jewelry store she had discovered during her lunch break. "Evie, you have to hear about this amazing place I found downtown," she began, her voice bubbling with apparent enthusiasm. "It's called Heritage Gems, and they specialize in vintage and antique jewelry. The owner is this fascinating older woman who knows everything about historical pieces. I was telling her about your ring, and she said she'd love to take a look at it." My stomach immediately tightened with apprehension. "You are discussing my ring with a stranger?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the surge of anger I felt at her presumption. "Oh, not in a gossipy way," Camille said quickly, though her tone suggested she didn't understand why I might be concerned. "I was just explaining how you have this lovely vintage piece from Oliver's family, and she mentioned that she sees a lot of people who inherit jewelry without really understanding what they have. Sometimes pieces that look modest are actually quite valuable, and sometimes," she paused meaningfully, "well, sometimes families pass down pieces that they think are more valuable than they actually are." The implication was crystal clear. Camille was suggesting that Oliver's family might have been mistaken about the ring's worth, and that I should have it professionally evaluated to discover the potentially disappointing truth about its actual value. She was framing this as helpful concern, but I could hear the underlying expectation that an appraisal would confirm her assessment of the ring as inferior. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but Oliver and I are perfectly happy with our ring exactly as it is. Its value to us is sentimental, not monetary." "Of course," Camille responded immediately, but I could hear the frustration in her voice at my resistance to her suggestion. "I just thought you might want to know for insurance purposes. I mean, what if it turns out to be worth more than you think? Wouldn't that be wonderful?" Or if it's worth less than expected, at least you'd know for coverage purposes. Either way, knowledge is power, right? The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Camille becoming increasingly insistent that I should have the ring appraised while maintaining the pretense that this was purely for my benefit. She mentioned several stories about friends who had discovered surprising truths about inherited jewelry, always framing these anecdotes in ways that suggested I was being naive or irresponsible by not seeking professional evaluation. Finally, worn down by her persistence and curious despite myself about what a professional assessment might reveal, I agreed to consider getting an appraisal. Camille immediately offered to arrange the appointment, to accompany me for support and to help me interpret whatever information we received. Her eagerness to be involved in this process felt uncomfortably intrusive, but I was too emotionally drained to argue further. The appointment was scheduled for the following Friday afternoon at Heritage Gems, a small but elegantly appointed jewelry store in downtown Hartford that specialized in estate and vintage pieces. Camille insisted on meeting me there, arriving 10 minutes early and chatting animatedly with Mrs. Patricia Goldstein, the store's owner, about vintage jewelry trends and appraisal processes. Mrs. Goldstein was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, who had obviously spent decades evaluating jewelry and assessing both stones and settings with professional expertise. She examined my ring initially with a standard jeweler's loupe, making non-committal sounds while studying the central stone and surrounding diamonds under her desk lamp. "Interesting piece," she murmured, adjusting her glasses and switching to a more powerful magnifying device. "The setting is definitely authentic Art Deco, probably 1920s as you mentioned. The craftsmanship is excellent. Let me take a closer look at these stones." For the next 30 minutes, Mrs. Goldstein conducted a thorough examination of the ring, using various tools and testing methods that I didn't fully understand. Camille watched anxiously, clearly hoping for confirmation of her suspicions about the ring's modest value. I found myself holding my breath, suddenly terrified that this examination might reveal something that would validate all of Camille's implications about Oliver's poor judgment, or his family's mistaken beliefs about their heirloom. Finally, Mrs. Goldstein looked up from her equipment with an expression I couldn't immediately interpret. "Miss Hayes," she said slowly, "I need to ask you some questions about this ring's provenance. You mentioned it came from your fiancé's grandmother's collection?" "Yes," I replied, feeling my heart rate accelerate. "Through a family friend named Rosalind Hayes, who is apparently my own grandmother." "Why? Is something wrong with it?" Mrs. Goldstein set down her loupe and leaned back in her chair, studying my face carefully. "Nothing is wrong with it," she said quietly. "Quite the contrary. This isn't just any vintage sapphire ring. Based on the stone's characteristics, the setting style, and the overall quality of the piece, I believe you may be wearing something quite extraordinary." Camille leaned forward eagerly, clearly expecting to hear confirmation that the ring was costume jewelry or contained synthetic stones. "What do you mean by extraordinary?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "I mean," Mrs. Goldstein said, picking up the ring again and holding it toward the light, "that this appears to be a cashmere sapphire from the 1920s, set in platinum with what look like old European cut diamonds. If my preliminary assessment is correct, this ring could be worth significantly more than most people would expect from its modest appearance." The words hit me like a physical shock. Camille's face went completely white as she processed what Mrs. Goldstein was suggesting. "How much more?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "I would need to conduct more comprehensive testing to give you a definitive assessment," Mrs. Goldstein replied carefully, "but cashmere sapphires of this quality and age are extremely rare and valuable. Combined with the platinum setting and these diamonds, which are also much higher quality than they initially appear, you could be looking at a piece worth anywhere from several $100,000 to over $1 million, depending on the exact specifications." The silence in the small jewelry store was deafening. Camille sat frozen in her chair, her mouth slightly open as she stared at the ring on my finger. Mrs. Goldstein continued explaining the rarity of cashmere sapphires and the historical significance of 1920s jewelry, but I could barely process her words over the roaring in my ears. This ring that Camille had spent months mocking, this pathetic excuse for an engagement ring that she had used to humiliate me publicly and question Oliver's commitment, was potentially worth more than most people's houses. Every snide comment about its modest appearance, every comparison to more obviously expensive rings, every implication that I was settling for inadequate treatment, all of it had been based on the assumption that visible size and obvious flashiness were the only measures of value. I would strongly recommend that you have this piece officially appraised by a certified gemologist, Mrs. Goldstein continued, apparently unaware of the emotional earthquake she had just triggered. And you should definitely contact your insurance company about adding it to your policy with appropriate coverage. A ring of this potential value should never be worn casually without proper protection. As we left the jewelry store 20 minutes later, Camille was unusually quiet, walking beside me in stunned silence while I tried to process the magnitude of what we had just learned. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. The ring she had used as evidence of my low standards and Oliver's inadequate commitment was potentially worth more than anything she would ever own. But beyond the vindication I felt about the ring's value, I was experiencing a more profound realization about the months of systematic criticism and humiliation I had endured. Camille's campaign against my ring hadn't been based on genuine concern for my well-being. It had been driven by her own need to feel superior and her inability to accept that someone else might possess something genuinely valuable without advertising that fact to the world. The question now was what to do with this information, and how to handle the inevitable conversation with Camille about everything she had said and done over the past months. For the first time since our engagement, I held all the cards in our relationship dynamic, and I was about to discover just how dramatically that shift in power would change everything between us. The walk from Heritage Gems to my car felt surreal, as if I were moving through a dream where the fundamental rules of reality had suddenly shifted. Camille walked beside me in complete silence for the first time in months, her usual stream of commentary conspicuously absent. The weight of Mrs. Goldstein's assessment hung between us like a physical presence, transforming every interaction we'd had about my ring over the past 6 months into something entirely different. When we reached my car, Camille finally spoke, her voice unnaturally subdued. "I guess we should get that official appraisal done," she said, not meeting my eyes. Just to be absolutely certain about what Mrs. Goldstein said. There was a strange quality to her voice, as if she were trying to convince herself that the jewelry store owner might have been mistaken, that somehow the devastating revelation about my ring's potential value could be disputed or minimized. "Yes," I agreed, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded despite the emotional chaos I was experiencing internally. "I think that would be wise." I unlocked my car and turned to face her directly for the first time since leaving the store. "Camille, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." She shifted uncomfortably, finally making eye contact. "Of course. What is it?" "All these months of comments about my ring, all the suggestions that Oliver chose poorly or that I was settling for something inadequate. Were you trying to help me, or were you trying to make me feel bad about my engagement?" The directness of my question clearly caught her off guard. For a moment, she looked like she might deny that there had been any pattern of criticism at all, but something in my expression must have convinced her that deflection wouldn't work this time. "I was trying to help you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I was worried that Oliver might not understand how to show proper commitment, or that you might be accepting less than you deserved because you're so focused on emotional meaning rather than practical considerations. So you thought the best way to help me was to publicly humiliate me at Rebecca's engagement dinner. To hold my ring up for comparison and suggest that I have low standards and modest expectations?" Camille's face flushed red as she realized I wasn't going to allow her to reframe that incident as anything other than deliberate cruelty. "That wasn't meant to be humiliating," she said weakly. "I was just trying to point out that different people have different priorities." "Stop," I interrupted, feeling a surge of clarity and strength that surprised me. "Just stop. We both know exactly what you were doing at that dinner, and it had nothing to do with helping me. You were using my ring as a prop to make yourself feel superior, to position yourself as someone who understands proper treatment, while I'm supposedly grateful for scraps." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I watched as Camille's expression cycled through denial, defensiveness, and finally a kind of defeated recognition that her behavior couldn't be explained away anymore. "I never meant to hurt you," she said quietly, but even this apology felt incomplete and self-serving. "Maybe you didn't set out specifically to hurt me," I replied, "but you certainly didn't care whether your comments and comparisons were hurtful, as long as they served whatever purpose you thought they were serving. And now it turns out that this ring you've been mocking for months might be worth more than both of our cars combined." We stood in the parking lot for another few minutes, the October afternoon air growing cooler around us as the sun began to set. I could see Camille struggling with the implications of what we had just learned, not just about the ring's value but about her own behavior over the past months. Finally, she asked the question I had been expecting. "Are you going to tell everyone about what Mrs. Goldstein said?" The question revealed so much about her priorities and concerns. She wasn't asking whether I was hurt by her behavior, or whether our relationship could be repaired, or whether I needed support processing this shocking revelation. She was asking whether I would use this information to humiliate her the way she had humiliated me. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I need to talk to Oliver first, and we need to get the official appraisal done. After that, we'll decide how much we want to share with family." The ambiguity of my response clearly made Camille uncomfortable, but I wasn't ready to offer her reassurance or protection from the consequences of her actions. For months, she had been operating under the assumption that my ring was worthless enough to justify public mockery. Now that assumption had been shattered, and she would have to live with the uncertainty about whether her cruelty would be exposed to the same audience that had witnessed it. I drove home in a state of emotional numbness, alternating between vindication about the ring's value and grief about what this revelation meant for my relationship with Camille. When I called Oliver that evening to share what had happened, his response was characteristically supportive and thoughtful. "I'm not surprised the ring is valuable," he said after I'd told him the whole story. "My grandmother always spoke about it with special reverence, and your grandmother Rosalind was known for having exquisite taste in jewelry. But Evelyn, I'm so sorry about what you've been going through with Camille. I had no idea her comments were so systematic and cruel." "I don't think I realized it myself until today," I admitted. "I kept making excuses for her behavior, telling myself she was just concerned, or that she didn't understand what she was saying. But standing in that parking lot after Mrs. Goldstein's assessment, I couldn't pretend anymore that this was innocent or well-intentioned. We talked for over an hour about the implications of the appraisal, about how to handle the information with our families, and about the deeper issues in my relationship with Camille that this situation had revealed. Oliver's perspective was invaluable because he had witnessed some of the family dynamics during our visits, but hadn't been subjected to the constant drip of criticism that I had experienced. "The most telling thing," he observed, "is that her first concern was whether you would tell people about the ring's value. Not whether you were okay, not whether she could apologize meaningfully, but whether her own reputation might suffer from having been wrong about something she'd been so confident about." His insight crystallized something I had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Camille's primary concern was still about her own image and social position rather than about the damage she had done to our relationship or my emotional well-being. Over the following week, I arranged for an official appraisal with a certified gemologist recommended by Mrs. Goldstein. The appointment took place at a prestigious jewelry house in Manhattan that specialized in estate and antique pieces. Dr. Victoria Sterling, the gemologist who conducted the evaluation, spent nearly 3 hours examining every aspect of the ring using sophisticated equipment I hadn't even known existed. When Dr. Sterling finally delivered her assessment, the news was even more extraordinary than Mrs. Goldstein had suggested. The central stone was indeed a cashmere sapphire of exceptional quality and rarity. The surrounding diamonds were old European cuts of remarkable clarity and color, and the platinum setting was crafted by a renowned jewelry house from the 1920s. The total appraised value was $2.3 million. Sitting in Dr. Sterling's elegant office, holding the official appraisal document that certified my ring's extraordinary worth, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, sadness, and profound irony. This ring, that had been the source of so much criticism and family tension, was worth more than most people could earn in a lifetime. Every snide comment Camille had made, every comparison she had drawn, every implication that I was settling for inadequate treatment, all of it had been based on the most superficial possible assessment of value and worth. But beyond the satisfaction of being proven right, I was grappling with deeper questions about my family relationships and my own tolerance for mistreatment. The ring's monetary value was shocking and vindicating, but the real revelation was about how willing I had been to accept systematic criticism and humiliation from someone who claimed to love me. As I drove home from Manhattan with the appraisal safely stored in my purse, I knew that the information I now possessed would fundamentally change my family dynamics. The question was no longer whether Camille had been wrong about my ring. That had been definitively established. The question was whether our relationship could survive the exposure of her true motivations, and whether my family could acknowledge and address the toxic patterns that had allowed this situation to develop in the first place. The conversation that would determine the future of these relationships was still ahead of me, and I was finally ready to have it from a position of strength rather than defensiveness. The moment of reckoning came 2 weeks later, at what was supposed to be our regular monthly family dinner at my parents' house in Maplewood. I had spent those 14 days carefully considering how to handle the revelation about my ring's true value, discussing various approaches with Oliver and Lauren, and ultimately deciding that the truth needed to be shared, but strategically and with clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't tolerate going forward. Oliver and I arrived at my parents' house that Sunday evening carrying the official appraisal document from Dr. Sterling, sealed in a manila envelope that I kept close to my side throughout the initial pleasantries. Camille was already there, having arrived early to help Mom with dinner preparations, and I noticed immediately that she seemed unusually subdued and watchful, clearly still processing our encounter at Heritage Gems and uncertain about what I might have decided to do with the information we'd received. Dinner conversation began normally enough, with updates about work projects, discussion of upcoming holidays, and Mom's latest interior design commissions. But I could feel an undercurrent of tension, particularly from Camille, who kept glancing at me as if trying to gauge my mood and intentions. She made no mention of jewelry or engagement rings, a notable departure from her usual pattern of steering conversations toward topics that would allow her to make pointed observations about material success and proper demonstrations of commitment. As we finished the main course and Mom began clearing plates, I made my decision to address the situation directly rather than allowing the uncertainty to continue indefinitely. "Before we move on to dessert," I said, my voice calm but carrying enough authority to command everyone's attention, "I have something important to share with all of you." The immediate shift in atmosphere was palpable. Dad set down his wine glass, Mom paused in her plate gathering, and Camille went completely still, her face already showing signs of apprehension about what was coming. 2 weeks ago, Camille suggested that I should have my engagement ring professionally appraised, I continued, pulling the manila envelope from my purse and placing it on the table. She was concerned that I might not understand what I actually had, and she thought it would be wise to get expert assessment for insurance purposes. Camille's eyes were fixed on the envelope as if it contained evidence of a crime she had committed. Mom and Dad looked between us with growing confusion, clearly sensing that this announcement was leading somewhere significant, but not yet understanding the implications. "So I took her advice," I said, opening the envelope and removing Dr. Sterling's official appraisal document. "I had the ring evaluated by Dr. Victoria Sterling, one of the most respected gemologists in New York City. She spent 3 hours conducting a comprehensive analysis of every aspect of the ring. I paused, looking directly at Camille, whose face had gone completely pale as she realized that whatever the appraisal had revealed, I was about to share it with our parents in a formal, deliberate way that would make it impossible to dismiss or minimize. According to Dr. Sterling's certified assessment, I continued, holding up the official document, this ring that Camille has spent the past 6 months describing as modest, practical, and embarrassingly cheap is actually worth $2.3 million. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and complete. Dad's mouth fell open slightly, Mom dropped the serving spoon she had been holding, and Camille looked as if she might faint. For several long moments no one spoke or moved, as if my words had temporarily suspended the normal flow of reality. $2.3 million? Dad finally managed to repeat, his voice barely above a whisper. $1 million? Mom added, sinking back into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her. I nodded, placing the appraisal document on the table, where everyone could see the official letterhead and Dr. Sterling's signature. The central stone is a cashmere sapphire from the 1920s, which are extremely rare and valuable. The surrounding diamonds are old European cuts of exceptional quality, and the platinum setting was created by a renowned jewelry house. The combination makes it an extraordinarily valuable piece. As the initial shock began to wear off, I watched my parents' expressions shift from amazement to a growing awareness of what this revelation meant about the months of commentary and criticism that had preceded it. Dad's eyes moved from the appraisal to Camille's stricken face, and I could see him beginning to process the implications of her behavior in light of this new information. Camille, Mom said slowly, her voice carrying a tone I had rarely heard her use with my sister, didn't you spend months telling Evelyn that her ring was, that Oliver had chosen something? She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We all knew exactly what Camille had been saying about my ring, and the contrast with its actual value made those comments appear not just wrong, but deliberately cruel and completely unfounded. I didn't know, Camille said weakly, her voice barely audible. I thought it looked so simple and modest. I was just trying to help Evelyn understand that she deserved better treatment. Better treatment than a $2.3 million ring? Dad asked, his tone carrying an edge I had never heard him use with Camille before. Better treatment than being given a priceless family heirloom that connects our families across generations? That's not what I meant, Camille protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I couldn't have known about the value. No one could have known just by looking at it. That's exactly the point, I said, finally speaking again after letting the revelation sink in. You couldn't have known the ring's monetary value just by looking at it. But you assumed it was worthless based on its appearance, and you used that assumption to humiliate me publicly, to question Oliver's commitment, and to suggest that I was settling for inadequate treatment. I paused, making sure I had everyone's full attention before continuing. But this isn't really about the money, is it? This is about the fact that you spent months making me feel embarrassed and defensive about something that represents love and commitment, without ever considering that your assumptions might be wrong or that your comments might be hurtful. Mom was looking at Camille with an expression I had never seen before, disappointment mixed with genuine anger. Camille, is this true? Have you been making Evelyn feel bad about her engagement ring? I was just concerned, Camille began, but Dad interrupted her. Concerned about what, exactly? That your sister might be happy with something that didn't meet your standards for impressive displays of wealth? The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we had ever had. For the first time in my memory, Camille was being held accountable by our parents for behavior that had caused real harm to another family member. The protection and excuse-making that had always surrounded her actions was absent, replaced by genuine confrontation about the cruelty she had demonstrated. "Do you remember Rebecca's engagement dinner?" I asked, my voice steady despite the emotion I was feeling. When you grabbed my hand and held it up next to Rebecca's ring, announcing to everyone that we represented both ends of the spectrum. When you told our entire extended family that I was grateful to be loved, regardless of how that love was expressed materially. Camille's face crumpled as the memory of that evening was brought into sharp focus, now recontextualized by the knowledge that my supposedly inferior ring was worth more than most people's houses. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was helping you see that you deserved more." "But I did deserve more," I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I deserved more respect from my own sister. I deserved not to be publicly humiliated at family gatherings. I deserved not to have my relationship questioned and diminished based on your superficial judgments about material worth." The revelation about the ring's value had given me something I had never possessed before in my relationship with Camille. Unassailable proof that her assumptions and judgments were fundamentally flawed. But more importantly, it had given me the confidence to finally articulate the damage her behavior had caused, regardless of the ring's monetary worth. As the evening continued, we had the most honest conversation our family had ever experienced about patterns of favoritism, different standards of accountability, and the long-term consequences of allowing one person's dramatic needs to consistently overshadow another's quieter but equally valid experiences. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly heard and supported by my parents, and Camille was forced to confront the reality of how her actions had affected others, rather than being protected from those consequences. The ring's extraordinary value had provided the catalyst for this reckoning, but the real transformation was in my family's willingness to finally acknowledge and address dynamics that had been damaging our relationships for years. 1 year after the revelation about my engagement ring's true value, our family gathered for Thanksgiving dinner at the elegant home Oliver and I had purchased together in the historic district of Mystic, Connecticut. Looking around our dining room table at the faces of my parents, Camille, Oliver, Lauren, and several close friends we had invited to join us, I marveled at how profoundly our relationships had transformed since that confrontational Sunday evening in my parents' house 12 months earlier. The journey toward this new dynamic had been neither quick nor easy. In the immediate aftermath of our family dinner revelation, Camille had initially retreated into defensiveness and self-pity, struggling to accept responsibility for the systematic nature of her criticism and the deliberate cruelty of her public humiliations. For several weeks, she alternated between tearful apologies and attempts to minimize the significance of her behavior, suggesting that anyone could have made the same mistake about the ring's value, and that her intentions had always been protective rather than malicious. The breakthrough came when Mom and Dad, clearly shaken by their recognition of how their own patterns of favoritism had enabled Camille's behavior, insisted that our family begin working with a professional therapist who specialized in sibling dynamics and family systems. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a warm but incisive psychologist with decades of experience in family therapy, helped us identify and address the deep-rooted patterns that had created such an imbalanced and ultimately destructive dynamic between Camille and me. Camille, Dr. Martinez had observed during one of our early sessions, "Your criticism of Evelyn's ring wasn't really about the ring at all, was it? It was about your own discomfort with the idea that your sister might possess something valuable without advertising that fact to the world, which challenged your understanding of how worth and success should be displayed." Those sessions were often emotionally brutal, forcing all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about our roles in perpetuating harmful dynamics. Camille had to acknowledge that her need to feel superior had led her to systematically undermine my happiness and confidence. My parents had to face their own responsibility for creating different standards of accountability and attention that had encouraged Camille's entitlement, while taking my reliability and emotional stability for granted. For my part, I had to examine my own patterns of enabling and people-pleasing, recognizing how my willingness to absorb criticism and prioritize family harmony over my own well-being had actually contributed to the perpetuation of these unhealthy relationships. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my tolerance for mistreatment hadn't been virtuous. It had been a form of self-abandonment that ultimately served no one's best interests. The most significant change came gradually, as Camille began to develop genuine empathy for the impact of her behavior, rather than simply feeling sorry for herself about being called to account. The turning point occurred during a session where Dr. Martinez asked Camille to imagine how she would have felt if someone had spent months publicly questioning her worth and mocking her most cherished symbols of love and commitment. "I would have been devastated," Camille admitted, her voice breaking as she finally allowed herself to fully inhabit my experience. "I would have felt humiliated and unsupported and completely alone. And if it had been my own sister doing it..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but the recognition in her eyes was genuine and complete. From that moment forward, Camille's approach to our relationship changed fundamentally. Instead of defensive explanations and qualified apologies, she began taking full responsibility for her actions and their consequences. She acknowledged that her behavior had been driven by jealousy and insecurity, rather than concern for my well-being, and she committed to the ongoing work of examining and changing these patterns in herself. The healing process was supported by practical changes in how our family interacted. We established new ground rules for family gatherings that prioritized respect and equality over dramatic entertainment. My parents made deliberate efforts to balance their attention and celebration of our respective achievements, showing genuine interest in my environmental work, while maintaining appropriate boundaries around Camille's tendency toward crisis-driven attention-seeking. Perhaps most importantly, Camille and I began building a new relationship based on genuine mutual respect, rather than the caretaker-dependent dynamic that had defined our interactions for years. She stopped expecting me to be available for every crisis and drama, while I stopped automatically sacrificing my own needs to manage her emotional regulation. We learned to interact as two independent adults who chose to support each other, rather than as locked-in roles that had become toxic for both of us. The transformation wasn't just evident in our family relationships, it rippled out into other areas of our lives as well. With the emotional energy that had previously been consumed by managing family dysfunction, I was able to pursue new professional opportunities and deepen friendships that had been neglected during years of crisis management. Camille, forced to develop her own emotional resilience and problem-solving skills, actually became more successful in her career and more satisfied with her personal relationships. Oliver and I had married 6 months after the ring revelation, in a ceremony that truly reflected our values and priorities rather than anyone else's expectations for impressive displays. I wore grandmother Rosalind's ring with complete confidence and joy, now understanding that its extraordinary value was just one more layer of meaning in an already perfect symbol of our love story. The wedding itself had been a celebration of authentic relationships and genuine connections. Camille served as my maid of honor, having earned that position through months of consistent effort to rebuild trust and demonstrate real change in her behavior. Her wedding speech was heartfelt and honest, acknowledging her past mistakes while celebrating the stronger relationship we had built together. As we enjoyed our Thanksgiving feast this year, conversation flowed naturally between serious topics and light-hearted stories, with everyone feeling heard and valued in ways that had been impossible during our previous family dynamics. When Camille mentioned that she had recently gotten engaged to Nathan, an environmental lawyer she had met through volunteer work, the announcement was met with genuine celebration rather than the performative excitement that had characterized previous family milestones. "I'd love for you to help me pick out a wedding dress," she said to me during dessert, her voice carrying the warmth of someone making a genuine request rather than issuing a dramatic demand for attention. "I value your taste, and I want this whole process to feel meaningful rather than just impressive." The request represented such a fundamental shift from our old dynamic that I felt tears prick my eyes. This was the sister I had always hoped to have. Someone who could ask for support without manipulation, who could celebrate my achievements without diminishment, and who understood that real love required respect and reciprocity rather than just dramatic gestures and crisis management. Later that evening, as Oliver and I cleaned up after our guests had left, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The revelation about my ring's value had been the catalyst for profound change, but the real transformation had come through our family's willingness to do the difficult work of examining and changing patterns that had been damaging our relationships for years. "You know what's interesting?" I said to Oliver as we loaded the dishwasher together. "I barely think about the ring's monetary value anymore. What matters is what it represents. Not just our love, but the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to understand true worth." He smiled, wrapping his arms around me from behind as we stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a genuinely joyful family celebration. "The ring was always perfect," he said softly, "but I'm glad your family finally learned to see its value the same way you do." The lesson I had learned wasn't just about the importance of not judging worth by appearances. It was about the courage required to demand respect, and the healing that becomes possible when people are willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to real change. Sometimes the most valuable transformations come from the most unexpected revelations, and sometimes standing up for yourself is the greatest gift you can give to everyone you love. As I looked down at my ring, catching the light from our dining room chandelier, I felt profound gratitude not just for its extraordinary monetary value, but for everything it had taught our family about the difference between surface judgments and true worth, between performing love and actually practicing it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.